What is up, everybody? My name is Sam Pratt. This is Rough Drafts, where I go deep every week on specific topics in the current limited format. That's kind of a lie this week. I'm going to be talking about a specific topic, but this topic applies to every limited format, not just the current limited format. I'm going to be talking about the differences between best of 1 and best of 3 on Arena. I play both best of 1 and best of 3 pretty equally. Usually I like to hit Mythic every month and then swap to best of 3 until the next month. So I think I'm in a pretty unique spot to speak on the differences. I think most people would expect a episode about best of 1 versus best of 3 to go in depth on sideboarding, and I am going to talk about sideboarding, but I'm not planning for that to be the only point of this episode. I really want to analyze what the different formats ask of you, and I'm hoping that that leads to thoughts about, how to position yourself for success in various formats, kind of what you're trying to get out of a draft in general. So the first thing, the biggest difference between best of 1 and best of 3, other than the fact that, you're playing best of 1 versus best of 3, is that best of 1 is ranked and best of 3 is unranked. So in best of 1, you are playing against people ostensibly of similar skill level to you, whereas in best of 3, you are paired primarily on record. So you could play someone who normally would be in bronze as your first match, and it goes from there. So the important part is that best of 1 is ranked, best of 3 is unranked, but in both of them, the drafts are never ranked. So in best of 1, when you enter a draft, you're with the bronze players, the silver players, not just the, plat, diamond, mythic players. There are pretty stark differences between the types of players that enter each event. In best of 1, like I said, you're ranked in game, but you're drafting with everyone, and the best of 1 player base is significantly larger than the best of 3 player base. This is something I actually have an issue with in Arena. When Arena was first getting set up, they said they had a lot of data saying that best of 1 was vastly more popular than best of 3. The issue is that they called best of 1 Premier Draft, and they had that as the only ranked format. So yes, of course, more people are going to funnel into the format called Premier Draft rather than traditional draft. If you're a new player, you're going to enter the one that says Premier Draft and has the little rank insignia, because that is what the client is telling you to play. So that's something I have an issue with. I think that's a pretty egregious misuse of data on their part. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter. Most people play best of 1. It's fine. Back to the topic at hand. The best of 1 player base is a lot larger. There's a lot more bad players. There's a lot more new players. And what this means, because the drafts are unranked, you're drafting with the entire player pool. You, dear listener, are more likely to be the best player at the pod. And I say you specifically because you are the one listening to this Magic podcast, and that is already so much more engaged than the vast majority of people that draft on Arena are. So because the format is worse, because you, the listener, are often going to be the best player at the table, the best of 1 pods are slower to pick up on format trends. And if there is a best deck or a worst deck, it is way easier to adapt to those base level, base format structure hierarchies than in best of 3. So if there's a best deck, in Aether Drift, you could be green, which was the best color, a lot longer in best of 1 than you could in best of 3, especially in the first half of the format. So I have had the most success and have seen the most success in best of 1, finding something that's consistently open and good and soft forcing it. That's not always the case, sometimes there's a variety of things that you choose from, but usually in best of 1, you want to position yourself as the best player at the table to end up with the best deck because it's going to be consistently open. So that involves either going into the draft having a plan or looking for a plan that you can enact over the course of multiple drafts. This is a concept of metagaming. On the other hand, best of 3 is unranked everywhere. And the player base being smaller, and you need to go out of your way to find traditional draft on the Arena client, it's going to be better players in general in the draft, but the spread of players that you play in the games are going to be much wider. So in best of one, you're drafting with everyone, but you're only playing against people of similar ranks. And as you rank up, that's going to get harder and harder. In best of three, it's always the same. So in your first match of your draft league, you could be playing against someone who is struggling to get out of bronze in best of one. So you do get paired against people playing, like 50 card decks, have no idea what they're doing in best of three way more often than you do in best of one. But it's not necessarily worse competition overall in the drafts. It's just a wider spread of player skill in the games. And like I said, it takes some effort on your part to actually find traditional draft in the client. So that attracts more enfranchised players. So the drafts are going to be harder too, which makes like the wider spread of players in best of three, it's harder to read the tables consistently over time. So like I said, in best of one, when you know something is good and consistently open, it's pretty easy to, soft force, like kind of live in one section of the metagame. And that happens sometimes in best of three too, but it's a lot harder to read the tables consistently. And I find myself having more success in best of three in the first, half of the format, drafting the hard way, really trying to read signals, get what's open. It's still good to go in with a plan. Be like, I want to be in this like section of the format or these decks, but you want to be more familiar with your off ramps. So like in Tarkir, just to give some concrete examples, the first couple weeks of the format, I was very consistently blue in best of one because I was getting Sig Appraiser so late, which meant I was positioning myself in Teamer quite often. And then once I hit Mythic and I swapped over to best of three, there were a lot more drafts where I was trying to get into blue. I couldn't get into blue, and then I would have to off ramp into like a green beatdown deck or something like that. And then there was like a section of the format where I was drafting Boros every time. So yeah, just a lot harder to read in best of three versus best of one. You can expect consistently that you're going to be the best player at the table. The other huge difference between best of one and best of three, other than best of one versus best of three and the types of players, is the hand smoother. And the hand smoother has a lot of misconceptions about it. So I'm going to explain what that is. It's only in best of one, and it's to mitigate the amount of non-games that happen and feel horrible when you're playing best of one versus best of three, where you have, two cracks at your opponent. So what the hand smoother actually does, it looks at this like ratio of lands and spells in your deck. So, if you have 17 lands, 23 spells, it takes that ratio, whatever that fraction is. It draws 3 different opening hands from your deck, and it selects the one with the closest ratio of lands and spells to that ratio of lands and spells in your deck. It's very important to understand that this only affects the land counts. It has no effect on the color distribution of your hand. Like, you're just as likely to open a hand, let's say you're a blue-white deck that has all islands in best of one and best of three. You're just a lot less likely to get hands in best of one that have 1 land or 6 or 7 lands, etc. It also does not have any effect on any draws besides the opening hand. So it's not, stacking your deck so you draw even lands and spells over the course of the game. There's a lot of misconceptions about this, both in how it works and the effects on it. A lot of people like to attribute the dominance of aggro over the last couple of years to the hand smoother. I don't quite think that's what's going on. I like to think of it as the only tangible advantage the hand smoother provides is that there are fewer mulligans in the game overall. What that means is that when you go into a game and everyone's mulliganing less, there's less threat of mulliganing, which means the opening hands are going to be a lot stronger. And in best of one, you need to expect your opponent to also have a good opening sequence. Now, this doesn't necessarily buff aggro. It works both ways. The control player is just as likely to have a good opening sequence as the aggro player. There's a lot more factors at play in the dominance of aggro, etc. It just makes everyone's deck more consistent, and it makes the opening sequences a lot more consistent for every player. And the opening sequence is very good. So in best of three, on the other hand, there are more mulligans. Because the threat of mulliganing is stronger, people are going to keep sketchier hands overall because there is a greater threat of mulliganing 2 times in a row. Like, you're way more likely to keep a 5-lander in best of 3 than best of 1. And there's also way fewer 5-landers in best of 1 in general. So with the opening sequences being more consistent and more strong in best of 1, a lot of people think that makes the games faster because people have better opening sequences by turn length, faster by turn length. And that's actually the opposite. If you go to 17 lands and look at the format speed page, every single format game length is shorter in best of 3 than it is in best of 1. This is pretty contradictory to what you would expect. You would expect if players have better opening sequences, it makes the game shorter because people are curving out and getting the game over. What this actually means is that there are more non-games in best of 3. So like in best of 3, the shorter games are because one player keeps a sketchy hand, they don't draw their 3rd land, or they draw like 3 lands in a row after they kept a 5-lander, the other player curves out and wins. This is very consistent format after format. Game length is always shorter in best of 3 than best of 1. And I really want to stress this idea of more non-games in best of 3, because this is going to get to one of the core ideas that I'm talking about today. In best of 3, you are strongly rewarded for having a deck with a higher floor. Decks that can draw well out of awkward opening sequences, either with ways to mitigate screw or mitigate flood, are pretty rewarded when the threat of mulliganing looms over both you and your opponent. In best of 3, you're more incentivized to put cards that reduce variance in your deck. This is a concept that I was made aware of by Andrew Cuneo when he guested on Lords of Limited about a year ago. It was during Outlaws, where he was talking about best of 3 in general, where a card like Harrier Strix, which was a 1-mana 1/1 flyer with like a loot activated ability. Like, this card was very bad in best of 1. When both people are curving out, like a 1-mana 1/1 flyer is just going to be too small. You never have time to activate that 3-mana loot ability. But in best of 3, on the other hand, when the games are awkward, like one player stumbles, maybe you need to hit land 4 and loot, that loot ability is going to be really impactful, both in the short games when people stumble to like make sure that you don't die to awkward mana, but also in the long games where like both players stumble, or like the aggro player stumbles and the control player like gets to take over. You know, the loot ability can also draw you out of flood, not just draw you out of screw. So that was where I first learned about this concept. The card I want to talk about today in general with best of 3 is Stormshriek Feral, which is the 5-mana 3/3 flying haste dragon with like the 2-mana +1/+0, and then has the omen of Tormenting Voice. This is the type of card where in best of 1, it's not great in your opening sequence. Like Tormenting Voice is not a very good card on turn 2 or turn 3 because you usually don't know what you want to discard with it. And then Tormenting Voice being 2-mana, discard 1, draw 2. And then like the dragon is just a little bit undersized in best of 1 in the opening sequence. Like turn 5, it's fine sometimes. So because opening sequences are so strong in best of 1, you are punished for playing these kind of weaker cards that their strength is that they reduce the variance in your opening sequences or like in the late game. You're punished for these because the opening sequences are so good because they're lower powered otherwise. But in best of 3, these cards become a lot more valuable because they can draw you out of these kind of sketchy scenarios that often don't come up at all in best of 1. So like I mentioned briefly that best of 3, you're rewarded for cards with a high floor. In best of 1, you are rewarded for cards with a high ceiling. And that is because you are ranked. You are playing against people of a similar rank, of a similar win rate, ostensibly of a similar like skill in general. As you get up and up in ranks, your opponent is always going to be the best drafter at their table like you. So you know that your opponent is going to have a good opening sequence also with the hand smoother. So you are rewarded for leveraging a deck with a high ceiling in its opening sequence versus your opponent. Like that's the thing that you want to maximize. Like the floor matters a lot less in best of 1 than the ceiling. To some respect, you know, like really volatile cards aren't going to do well in either place, but It's just those cards that are like the value of them are high floor. Those are way less valuable in best of one than best of three, where they're really helpful in those awkward scenarios. I want to talk briefly about this high floor, high ceiling comparison between best of one and best of three. And I'm going to talk briefly about the reward structures in best of one and best of three. Just in terms of the payouts that each of the event give. Best of one is a very even payout. You break even at roughly the record of 4-3 or 5-3. Like that is the record that you would get to like get all of the currency that you spent to enter the draft back. That's a very even win rate. That's like, what is that? Like a 50-60% win rate. So consistency is key. And like I said before, like you are rewarded for having a plan, enacting the plan. It's a good deck. It's open. You can kind of soft force it. Best of three, on the other hand, the reward structure is extremely top heavy. You don't break even on gem payouts in best of three on Arena unless you trophy. So that means that trophy rate is way more important than win rate. You basically need to trophy 1 in every 3 drafts to have a gem positive record in best of three. Like you can go 2-1 over and over again, and you're going to be down a lot of gems. And this is really a paradox between what the reward structures of the format are asking you to do and what the formats themselves are lending themselves to do. So in best of one, the drafters are worse, but you are ranked. Everyone has a good opening sequence. These are all things that pay you out for having your deck having a very high ceiling. However, the best of one reward structure incentivizes very high floors. Like you are fine to go 4-3, 5-3 draft after draft. On the other hand, best of three is unranked. All of the drafters are better, and there are worse opening sequences. So these are all things that you would want to be able to have a high floor because you want your deck to be able to draw out of awkward opening sequences so you don't lose to just your opponent playing random stuff and you don't draw your third land. However, the best of three reward structure is extremely top heavy. Like you need to be able to trophy draft after draft. If you're going 2-1 draft after draft, you're going to be down a whole bunch of gems. I think this is a really interesting paradox, and I respect the Arena development team. I think this was an oversight when they were first putting these formats together. Or it's intentionally malicious to, just turn a profit out of the way that we play this game. The draft and reward ranked structure in Arena Best of One has always kind of been an afterthought. Like they kind of just threw the exact same reward structure as the constructed events or the constructed ladders at us. And it never really felt like the best of one reward structure was optimized for what draft really is. So, the platonic ideal of draft is you're drafting in pod with 8 players. So you only play the people at your table. And I think that the best of three structure is fine of like, you're unranked. I actually am a proponent of not bringing ranked to best of three because I like that there is best of one and best of three as kind of two different things, like asking two different questions of you strategically. Like I said, best of one, you want to have like high ceiling. You're playing against other players with really good decks. You want to maximize your ceiling as an edge. Best of three, you really care about your high floor. I like that those two things exist in opposition. I think that the payout structure would be a lot more palatable if you were if you were not literally draining money for having a 66% win rate in best of three. So like I said, I play both. I really like the ladder grind when a format is clicking. I've been really high on ladder before. In Lord of the Rings, I was ranked 2 at my peak. And I think when you're really tuned into a format or have a deck that you can force, it's really exciting to be able to do that. But in general, I prefer best of three. I really like that you're drafting with better people. You end up in a greater variety of decks draft after draft. I just like playing best of three Magic better than best of one, but they're both good. So I'm going to get off my soapbox now and talk a little bit more about the actual strategy of what changes in best of three versus best of one. Really considering what it means to build a deck with a higher floor. It's kind of weird because so much limited discourse is centered around best of one. And I'm really framing these points in opposition to best of one, which is funny because Magic lived without best of one for 20 years. Like best of one is the newcomer here, but it's just interesting that everything in limited nowadays is so centered around best of one. So this is all about best of three. So the first category of cards I want to talk about is Variance Busters. This is actually an official Wizards of the Coast term. There's like this article called Nuts and Bolts number 16 Play Boosters, where Mario goes through like what their design skeleton for a play booster set is. And one of the slots is like these cheap artifacts that smooth your draws that they call Variance Busters. So that's something like Embermouth Sentinel in this set, which is the like 2-drop that gets a land on top of your library. The Devotees are actually, I think, a really good example of Variance Busters too, where these are cards that are cheap. They're, pretty desirable to cast, or like they're fine cards to include for the most part. And they really smooth your opening sequences. Now, the Devotees ended up being pretty good in best of one as well because of the 3-color nature of this format. There's a lot of other examples in Tarkir specifically. There's Embermouth Sentinel, which is a card I actually really don't like, even in best of three. I'll play it sometimes more in best of three than best of one, because best of three is slightly more forgiving for having a singular, really bad card in your opening sequence, like Embermouth Sentinel, if it can draw you out of these awkward scenarios like Screw. The common Omen Dragons are really good Variance Busters as well. And I'm going to talk about these a little in the next point that I'm going to bring up as well. I mentioned Stormshriek Feral having Tormenting Voice. Tormenting Voice, like I said, is not the best thing to cast on turn 2, but if you really need to hit your 3rd land drop, that's going to be good. And, you're going to have a little more time in best of 3 to do that, because oftentimes your opponent is also going to have a slightly awkward opening hand. So all of the common Omen Dragons have like a cantrip mode, like the black one puts a counter on something and draws a card. The white one, you can cast it just as Grizzly Bears. These are all really good ways to have like high impact cards in your deck that kind of bail you out in awkward scenarios. And that can really be the key to a match in best of 3. And I want to reiterate that these are less good in best of 1 because you want to anticipate your opponent having a really good, strong opening sequence, and you want to match that. So you want your deck to be prepared for that and have a higher ceiling, because that's kind of the skill edge that you get in the draft portion against your other opponents. The Variance Busters are more busting variants for Screw, for Mana Screw. They'll find you extra lands, draw you extra cards to hit land drops, maybe fix your mana. The other side of that coin is Flood, and Flood is also more prevalent in best of 3 than best of 1. I did mention that best of 3 is faster in general than best of 1. You can go and look at the format speed page, because sometimes one player curves out and the other player, misses their 3rd land drop. But there's a lot of games too where both players keep a sketchy hand, both players mulligan, the aggro player stumbles, and games get awkward and flood out and get into a top deck scenario. And being able to draw out of Flood can also be just as important as drawing out of Screw in these awkward games. And a class of cards that I've come up on in best of 3 versus best of 1 are what I'm calling game enders. And these are cards that, are not going to be good in your opening hand. Maybe they're like a 5-drop or a 6-drop, but they're like singular threats that can really end the game. These are the types of cards that generally get super overrated because players remember the times when they lose to, Sheevan Dragon, even though like Sheevan Dragon is like a horrible opening hand card because you can't cast it till turn 6. And the common Omen Dragons are so perfect for this as well. Something like Stormshriek Feral, you have that bailout Tormenting Voice mode early. If you are in a top deck scenario, your opponent doesn't have a flyer, you rip a Stormshriek Feral, you suddenly get to dump all of your mana into it every single turn, and that's going to end the game very, very quickly. So because the games get awkward, having singular threats that can end the game can be better, and these really get punished in best of 1 when everyone is, has good opening sequence, is curving out. Now, I want to stress, this is not an excuse to build a high curve deck. This is not an excuse to build a clunky deck. This is not an excuse to have a worse deck or a slower deck or anything. Best of 3 is not necessarily slower than best of 1. Your plan should still be to bring a consistent deck, a good deck, a strong deck, a deck that can have a good opening sequence. But the drafts are tougher. You don't always get these good opening hand cards. It is good to account for these scenarios where games are going to get awkward. So you don't, in best of 3, have more time. It's just slightly more forgiving in your opening sequences. Another card in addition to these common Omen Dragons is Tempest Hawk. This is a card that in best of 1 is really bad. Like, Wind Drake has proven set after set to be really bad in your opening hand, to be really bad in these more aggressive, curve out formats. In best of 3, when players are stumbling a little more often, Tempest Hawk is going to be really good to draw you out of Flood because you're going to play it on curve. Maybe your opponent stumbled. It punishes stumbles very well. It draws you out of Flood. It gives you things to do with your mana. It's kind of a singular threat that can end the game. I think, Tempest Hawk is not like an all-star of this format. Like, I'm not going crazy for it in best of 3, but it's something that's a lot more palatable in best of 3 than best of 1 because players' opening sequences are a lot less intense. Like I mentioned, I didn't want this episode to be entirely about sideboarding, but I do want to talk about sideboarding. I am not like an expert in sideboarding, but I do get the feeling that it's not talked about enough, obviously because more people play best of 1 than best of 3. I just get the sense that it's not quite thought of enough in limited in general versus, constructed. It's such a huge part of constructed, but you get your entire pool in limited as your sideboard, and you have the opportunity to build the best deck possible versus your opponent every game 2 and 3 that you play. And if you have other playables in your sideboard, there's probably like a more optimal version of your deck versus your opponent in most scenarios. And I don't sideboard most of the time. So I just have this hunch that I don't sideboard enough, that people in general don't sideboard enough. So I'm going to talk about kind of the different things I think about during sideboarding. Like I said, I'm not an expert in sideboarding, but I feel like thinking about this really hard, I've come up with a number of different concepts that I can think about during sideboarding. So level 0 is to bring in direct answers. This is the one that most people think about during sideboarding. So like your opponent has a really good enchantment, you're going to bring in Heritage Reclamation to blow it up. That's not really super relevant in this format. One thing that I do in terms of this is if my opponent's playing a Dragon's deck, I will bring in a Sarkhan's Resolve, which is just, 2 mana, destroy target creature with flying. That's a very direct answer. I think most people grasp this, like Naturalize is a sideboard card, etc. The next level is a lot more complicated than just lining up direct answers. It's more about lining how your cards line up versus your opponent. So again, not a Tarkir example, but say you have a bunch of deal 3s and your opponent has a bunch of X4s, like they're playing like a slower green deck. This is a bad example because cards that deal 3 damage are generally very good and limited, but you might think about cutting some of those deal 3s because they're not going to have fantastic targets. Another example in Tarkir might be you have a Salt Road Skirmish, which is like a 4 mana kill spell, and your opponent's playing a very low to the ground Boros aggro deck. That might not be like a 4 mana value sorcery speed removal spell might not be effective when almost all of your opponent's threats are going to be like 1 and 2 mana. If your opponent has like an Undergrowth Leopard and you have a bunch of different options like Osseous Exhale in the sideboard, you might want to cut your Stormplane Detainment. These all feel like bad examples for Tarkir, but this is the kind of thing I'm thinking about. Like maybe your opponent has no 2-drops, you cut your Channeled Dragonfire. Just kind of like lining up the cards in your deck versus your opponent's deck. Like maybe your opponent is playing like a heavy control deck. You aren't going to have a lot of targets for your Piercing Exhale early. So you cut that for an Alesha's Legacy to kind of blank their removal spells. This kind of like card by card, like my opponent has this class of cards. This card that I have in my main deck doesn't line up super well against that. I'm going to board that out. That's the kind of thinking that I'm talking about here. The next level removed from that would be not lining up individual cards, but lining up your entire game plan versus your opponent's. really analyzing like who's the beatdown. This would be like I mentioned in the past couple weeks of sideboard cards that are good against green. Like if your opponent is playing like a green deck with singular large monsters, a card like Arishan Sunshield, like a tapper, is going to be a lot more effective versus that. Edicts, that's going to be really effective against those green decks. If you are a mid-range deck, like a very mid-range deck, and your opponent is playing a heavy control deck, you can, who's the beatdown? You need to be the beatdown. You might want to bring in extra 2-drops to get on the board earlier to actually have a chance to pressure them as your mid-range deck. Whereas like in a lot of matchups, you might not be interested in kind of a generic 2-drop because you don't know the role that your deck is going to play. So those are 3 kind of levels that I think about during sideboarding. There's like the direct answers, like bringing in naturalizes. There's like my shock doesn't line up against all their X3s. And then there's like the third, like kind of who's the beatdown? How do I build the best version of my deck to compete against my opponent's game plan? The other thing that I've thought a lot about in sideboarding over the past year or so, it's something that I've been doing a lot and I don't see other people do very often, is sideboard lands in and out. I could just be crazy. It could just be me, thinking way too hard about it, being kind of full of myself. But lands are cards too. And something that I've realized is you can really take into account whether you're on the play versus whether you're on the draw in best of 3. So if you're on the play, you see one fewer card. And sometimes that will mean that I want one more land in my deck so that I can nail my opening sequence more consistently. And then when I'm on the draw, you see one more card. You can be a tiny bit more lax on land counts because you're more likely to be able to happily keep a 2-lander when you're on the draw and see one more card. This is really marginal. This is a very small thing. Most of my decks don't do this. If my deck is already really close in deck building between like say I'm an aggro deck that's really close between 16 or 17, like I don't have a great 24th card, I'm going to start on 17. And then when I'm on the draw, I'm going to cut an extra land out of my deck and go to 16 on the draw because I see an extra card in my opening sequence. And like I have a better chance of having the appropriate lands and spells count in that opening sequence, and then I'm more resistant to flood because I have one more spell in my deck. On the other hand, maybe I'm a green deck that's splashing a lot. I have a bunch of Sagu Wildlings, which often want me to cut lands, but I have really high color requirements. So sometimes there I'll start on 16, but when I'm on the play, I feel like I really need to nail my opening sequence. I'll go up to 17 on the play so that I have less of a chance of getting screwed in the opening sequence. Another example, like kind of the third example, is I'm like a really super late game deck that's very happy with 18 lands. A lot of times when I'm start with 18 lands, I will go to 17 on the play just to get an extra spell in, especially because once you know what your opponent is doing, you can identify which spell in your sideboard is going to be best against them. Whereas a lot of times in game 1, you're going to be very happy just to have that extra land to smooth things over. So this is something that I've been doing a lot. I've been really happy with. Just don't forget that lands are cards too. And this sort of thing, like trimming lands, adding lands, can be really helpful to squeak, the last sideboard card in versus your opponent. That's going to wrap it up between the discussion of best of 1 and best of 3. I hope this was enlightening. Like I said, I wanted this to be a little more evergreen. I do feel like I'm in a pretty unique position as someone who plays best of 1 and best of 3 pretty equally. I haven't seen any other content really discussing the differences between them besides that Cuneo guest episode on Lords of Limited. So I hope this was helpful. I really want to stress, don't look at these tips as an excuse to build a worse deck in best of 3, but they're kind of edges to consider, marginal advantages of avoiding like the greater variance that you get in best of 3 when you have to mulligan more. So I love best of 3. I love playing both best of 1 and best of 3. I know way more people play best of 1. I would really recommend giving best of 3 a shot. The reward structure can be kind of punishing, but I do feel like I have the best games of Magic in best of 3, and I have the most enjoyment playing best of 3 in general. So I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to talk about next week. We have one more Tarkir episode until I'm going to do probably an episode on Final Fantasy previews. And then the week after that is the first week of Final Fantasy. So really wrapping it up here. If you have a suggestion of what I should talk about next week, you can find me on Blue Sky at sampratt.bsky.social. You can find me on Discord at samp6. And I stream very occasionally. Most of the time, this has been on Thursday evenings, US time, at samp_mtg. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.